The desert stretched endless and unforgiving under the merciless July sun, its heat waves distorting the horizon into shimmering mirages that promised water where none existed. Thomas Garrett wiped the sweat from his weathered brow with a calloused hand, his 52 years of frontier living etched into every line of his sun-darkened face. The wagon creaked ominously beneath him, its right rear wheel wobbling with increasing violence as he urged his two horses forward across the cracked earth. He'd been transporting supplies from Silver Springs back to his ranch near the foothills, a journey he'd made countless times since settling this harsh land 15 years ago. The weight of fence posts, barbed wire, and provisions strained the aging wagon, and Thomas knew he'd pushed his luck too far by delaying repairs. When the wheel finally gave way with a splintering crack that echoed across the emptiness, the wagon lurched violently to one side, sending him sprawling into the dust. Pain exploded through his left shoulder as he hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. His horses whinnied in panic, straining against their harnesses as the crippled wagon threatened to drag them backward down the slight incline. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from in the comments below. Thomas lay there for a moment, tasting blood and dust, his shoulder throbbing with a pain that suggested something more than bruising. At his age, a fall like that could mean broken bones, and out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, that could be a death sentence. He forced himself to his feet, grimacing as he cradled his injured arm and assessed the damage to his wagon. The wheel had shattered completely, spokes jutting out at grotesque angles, the iron rim bent beyond any hope of field repair. His horses stamped nervously, their flanks dark with sweat, and he moved carefully to calm them, speaking in the low, steady voice he'd used for decades with animals and frightened men alike. The sun beat down relentlessly, and Thomas calculated his options with the cold pragmatism of a man who'd survived the war between the states and the subsequent chaos of Reconstruction. He had water for perhaps 2 days if he rationed carefully, but his shoulder was already stiffening, and he suspected internal injuries from the fall. Walking back to Silver Springs was suicide in this heat, and his ranch lay even farther in the opposite direction. Then, squinting against the glare, he spotted something he'd never noticed in all his trips along this trail. A small structure, perhaps half a mile off the main path, partially hidden by a cluster of scraggly mesquite trees. The shack looked like it might collapse if someone breathed on it too hard, its weathered boards bleached gray by years of sun and wind. Thomas unhitched his horses, fashioned a crude lead from rope in his saddlebag, and began the painful trek toward what might be his only chance at survival. Each step sent jolts of agony through his shoulder, and he could feel something grinding in the joint that shouldn't be grinding. The horses followed reluctantly, sensing his distress, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dust that hung in the still air. As he drew closer, Thomas noticed signs of habitation. A small vegetable garden, struggling valiantly against the desert. A chicken coop, with a few scrawny birds scratching in the shade. And a water trough that suggested a well nearby. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, impossibly thin in the shimmering heat, and Thomas wondered what kind of person would choose to live in such isolation. He called out as he approached, his voice rough from dust and pain, announcing himself in the way of the frontier, where surprising someone could get you shot. The door opened slowly, and a woman emerged, rifle held with the easy competence of someone who knew how to use it. She was perhaps 40 years old, Thomas judged, with auburn hair streaked with gray pulled back in a practical bun. Her dress was simple, but clean, patched in places but well-maintained, and her face showed the weathering of frontier life mixed with something else. A deep sadness that lived in her green eyes, even as she assessed him with cautious intelligence. For a long moment, they studied each other across the dusty yard, two survivors of the harsh West, each calculating risk and intent. Thomas raised his good hand slowly, the universal gesture of peace, and explained his situation in short, painful sentences. The woman lowered her rifle slightly, her eyes taking in his cradled arm, the dust and blood on his clothes, and the obvious exhaustion in his stance. She introduced herself as Margaret Holloway, her voice carrying the soft remnants of a Tennessee accent, worn smooth by years in the desert, and gestured for him to approach. As Thomas stumbled the last few yards to her small porch, his legs finally giving out, Margaret caught him with surprising strength, guiding him into the relative cool of her shack. The last thing he remembered before darkness claimed him was the smell of herbs and baking bread, oddly comforting in that moment of surrender. When consciousness returned, Thomas found himself lying on a narrow bed, his shirt removed and his shoulder wrapped in clean bandages that smelled of something medicinal. The pain had receded to a dull throb, and he realized groggily that he'd been given something for it. Laudanum, probably, or some herbal mixture. The room was small, but meticulously clean, with shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, roots, and mysterious powders. Sunlight filtered through a small window, lower in the sky now, suggesting hours had passed since his collapse. Margaret sat in a chair near the bed, mending what looked like a shirt. Her hands moving with practiced efficiency, she noticed his wakefulness immediately and set aside her sewing, rising to check his bandages with gentle but firm hands. She explained in her quiet voice that his shoulder had been dislocated, not broken as he'd feared, and the relief that flooded through Thomas was immense. A dislocation would heal, given time, while a break at his age might never properly mend. She'd also treated various cuts and bruises, cleaned the road dust from his wounds, and gotten water and a thin broth into him. While he was semi-conscious, Thomas tried to sit up, instinctively uncomfortable with being vulnerable before a stranger. But Margaret's hand on his good shoulder kept him down with surprising authority. Over the next 3 days, as Thomas's body slowly began to heal under Margaret's capable care, he learned her story in fragments, pieced together from brief comments and longer silences. She'd come west with her husband, Daniel, 12 years ago, chasing the promise of land and opportunity that the frontier offered to those brave or desperate enough to claim it. They'd built this shack together, scratched out a living from the unforgiving desert, and planned for a future that included children and prosperity. Daniel had been a kind man, she said, though not particularly strong or skilled at frontier survival, a clerk from Nashville who dreamed of becoming a rancher. 5 years ago, he'd gone into Silver Springs for supplies and never returned, killed in a saloon brawl over a card game he wasn't even playing in. Just an innocent bystander caught by a stray bullet when a dispute turned violent. Margaret had buried him in a small plot behind the shack, marked with a simple wooden cross, and had stayed on alone, unable or unwilling to return to the life she'd left behind in Tennessee. She survived through a combination of remarkable resourcefulness and knowledge of desert plants and their medicinal uses, selling remedies to the occasional traveler and trading eggs and vegetables to passing freight wagons. Thomas listened to her story with the quiet respect of someone who understood loss and loneliness, recognizing in her isolation a mirror of his own emotional desert. On the fourth day, Thomas was strong enough to sit at Margaret's small table, eating the simple but nourishing meals she prepared with ingredients coaxed from her struggling garden. His shoulder remained stiff and painful, but the worst of the injury had passed, and he could move his arm without the grinding sensation that had terrified him initially. Margaret refused payment for her care, waving away his offers with a firmness that brooked no argument, saying that frontier hospitality wasn't something to be bought and sold. Instead, they talked. Long conversations that ranged from the practical matters of desert survival to deeper topics neither had discussed with anyone in years. Thomas spoke of his own losses, of the wife who died giving birth to their stillborn son 7 years ago, leaving him alone in a ranch house that had once echoed with her laughter. He described how work had become his salvation and his prison, how he'd driven himself into exhaustion rather than face the emptiness of his evenings, how he'd watched other ranchers remarry and rebuild their lives, while he'd convinced himself that his time for such things had passed. Margaret listened without judgment, her eyes reflecting understanding born of her own solitary years. And in those conversations, Thomas felt something long dormant stir within his chest, a recognition of shared humanity, of the possibility that isolation was a choice rather than an inevitable condition. The repair of Thomas's wagon became a joint project, with Margaret proving surprisingly knowledgeable about woodworking and mechanics. Her late husband might not have been a natural frontiersman, but he'd been meticulous about maintaining their equipment, and Margaret had absorbed those lessons well. Together, they fashioned a new wheel using lumber from Margaret's small shed, materials she'd been saving for eventual repairs to her own dwelling. Thomas protested at first, uncomfortable with taking resources she might need. But Margaret pointed out with irrefutable logic that she had no wagon to use the wheel on, while he did, and that neighbors helped each other survive in this harsh land. The work was slow, limited by Thomas's healing shoulder and the brutal midday heat that made any physical labor dangerous. But it gave structure to his convalescence and created a comfortable rhythm to their days. They worked in the relative cool of morning and evening, rested during the scorching afternoon hours, and gradually assembled a functional wheel through patience and collaboration. As they worked side by side, their hands occasionally touching as they positioned boards or tightened bindings, Thomas became increasingly aware of Margaret, not just as his rescuer, but as a woman, intelligent, capable, and carrying a quiet strength that matched the harsh land she'd chosen to endure. By the end of the second week, the wheel was complete and mounted on Thomas's wagon, the repair solid enough to carry him and his supplies back to his ranch. His shoulder had healed sufficiently for travel, though Margaret warned him to avoid heavy lifting for at least another month, and provided him with packets of herbs for making poultices if the pain returned. Thomas loaded his horses, checked the wagon's integrity multiple times, and prepared for departure, but found himself strangely reluctant to leave. Margaret stood in the shade of her porch, watching his preparations with an expression he couldn't quite read. Resignation, mixed with something that might have been disappointment. The practical part of his mind argued that he'd imposed on her hospitality long enough. that his ranch had surely fallen into disorder during his absence, and that he had responsibilities waiting. But another part, one that had been silent for 7 long years, whispered that leaving might be the biggest mistake of his life. He paused in his preparations, turned to face Margaret fully, and asked a question that surprised them both with its directness. Would she consider leaving this isolated shack and coming to his ranch, not as a hired hand or even as repayment for her care, but as his wife, as a partner in building something more than just survival? The silence that followed stretched long enough that Thomas feared he badly misjudged the situation, that his weeks of convalescence had created a false intimacy that existed only in his imagination. Margaret's face showed a succession of emotions: surprise, uncertainty, something that might have been hope, and finally a deep wariness born of past hurt. She asked him quietly if he was proposing out of obligation, out of gratitude for her care, or if he truly believed they could build something real together. Thomas considered his answer carefully, understanding that honesty mattered more than romance in this moment, and told her the truth as he understood it. That he'd spent 7 years convincing himself he was content with loneliness, that her care had healed more than just his physical injuries, and that he recognized in her a kindred spirit who understood both loss and the possibility of beginning again. He admitted he couldn't promise passionate declarations or grand gestures, that he was a practical man, worn rough by frontier living, but that he believed they could create something solid and true if she was willing to take the risk. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his weathered face for deception or false promises, and Thomas met her gaze steadily, letting her see his sincerity. Margaret's acceptance came not with words but with action. She turned and began packing her belongings with the efficient movements of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't second-guess it. Thomas helped her gather her possessions, which were remarkably few: clothes, her collection of medicinal herbs, and knowledge written in careful notebooks, her husband's tools that she'd maintained so faithfully, and a few personal items that held memories she wasn't ready to abandon. They buried the key to the shack under the porch step, a frontier tradition for abandoned dwellings that any desperate traveler might use for shelter, and Margaret said a quiet goodbye to the grave behind the house, promising Daniel that she was choosing life over grief. The journey back to Thomas's ranch took 3 days, the repaired wagon holding steady under their combined possessions and supplies, the 2 horses pulling faithfully despite the added weight. They traveled slowly, partly because of Thomas's still healing shoulder, but mostly because neither felt the need to rush toward their uncertain future. At night, they camped under the vast desert sky, sharing stories and silences, building the foundation of partnership through honest conversation rather than romantic illusion. Thomas told her about his ranch, its modest house, the struggling cattle operation, the endless work that awaited them. And Margaret shared her knowledge of desert medicine, of how to coax vegetables from reluctant soil, of practical skills that would complement his ranching expertise. When they finally crested the last rise and Thomas's ranch came into view, Margaret saw not the prosperous spread she might have imagined, but rather a functional, well-maintained operation showing signs of recent neglect. The house was solid but plain, the corrals needed repair, and weeds had overgrown the kitchen garden Thomas's late wife had once maintained. But Margaret also saw potential. A good well with sweet water, enough land to support both cattle and cultivation, and structures built to last by someone who understood the demands of frontier life. Thomas watched her face carefully as she surveyed what would become her new home, seeing her practical assessment rather than disappointment, and felt a cautious optimism take root. They spent the first weeks establishing routines, learning each other's rhythms and preferences, negotiating the countless small compromises required when two long solitary people attempt to build a shared life. Margaret transformed the neglected garden into a productive plot, using her desert knowledge to select plants that could survive the harsh conditions, while Thomas focused on repairing corrals and restoring order to his ranching operations. They were married by a traveling circuit judge who happened through their area 6 weeks after Margaret's arrival. A simple ceremony with no witnesses except Thomas's foreman and Margaret's chickens, which she'd brought from her shack and which now ruled the ranch yard with fierce territorial pride. The marriage was not without struggles. Both carried deep scars from previous losses. Both had grown accustomed to solitary decisions and rhythms, and the adjustment to partnership proved more difficult than either had anticipated. There were moments of sharp disagreement, times when Thomas's stubborn independence clashed with Margaret's equally strong will, evenings when they retreated to separate corners of their home, uncertain whether they'd made a terrible mistake. But there were also moments of unexpected grace. Morning coffee shared in comfortable silence on the porch. Margaret's quiet pride when Thomas praised her medicinal poultices. Thomas's gratitude when his shoulder fully healed without permanent damage. And the slow accumulation of small intimacies that built trust. Margaret brought not just practical skills, but also a softness that had been missing from the ranch. A reminder that survival wasn't the same as living. She filled the house with the scent of baking bread and drying herbs, hung curtains in windows that had been bare for years, and gradually transformed the functional dwelling into something that felt like home. Thomas, in turn, provided security and partnership, sharing the burden of frontier survival and offering a future beyond isolated endurance. By the end of their first year together, the ranch showed visible signs of their partnership: expanded gardens, repaired structures, and a healthier cattle herd that reflected Thomas's renewed energy and focus. More importantly, both Thomas and Margaret showed signs of healing that went far deeper than physical wounds. The deep sadness that had lived in Margaret's eyes had softened into something more peaceful, and Thomas moved through his days with a lightness that hadn't been present in years. They'd learned to navigate disagreements, to respect each other's need for occasional solitude, and to appreciate the complementary strengths each brought to their partnership. The neighboring ranchers, initially skeptical of Thomas's sudden marriage to an unknown widow from the desert, gradually accepted Margaret as she proved her worth through her medical knowledge, treating injuries and illnesses that might otherwise have required expensive trips to distant doctors. She became known for her healing skills, and Thomas took quiet pride in her growing reputation, understanding that her value extended far beyond her contributions to their ranch. On a cool evening in their second spring together, Thomas and Margaret sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and purple. Thomas's shoulder had healed completely, stronger now than before the injury, and Margaret had just returned from helping a neighboring family through a difficult childbirth, successfully bringing both mother and baby through the ordeal. They sat in companionable silence, hands clasped loosely, and Thomas reflected on the strange path that had brought them together. A broken wagon wheel, a desperate stumble toward an isolated shack, and a widow who'd healed more than just his physical wounds. Margaret leaned against his shoulder, fitting perfectly against his weathered frame, and murmured that she was grateful for his accident, grateful for the chance to choose life over grief, grateful that neither of them had let fear prevent this second chance at building something meaningful. Thomas agreed quietly, understanding now that healing wasn't just about mended bones or resolved grief. It was about the courage to remain open to possibility, even when life had taught harsh lessons about loss. The desert stretched before them, still harsh and unforgiving, but no longer quite so lonely or empty. They'd both learned that survival could transform into something richer, that isolation was a choice rather than a destiny, and that sometimes the greatest healing came not from solitude, but from the willingness to share your scars with someone who understood their weight. The following months brought challenges neither had anticipated, testing the foundation of their partnership in ways that revealed both its strengths and its fragility. The summer proved brutally hot, even by desert standards, with temperatures that drove cattle to cluster in whatever shade could be found, and turned the earth so hard that Margaret's garden required constant attention to survive. Thomas's herd began showing signs of distress, and he spent long days riding the range, checking water sources and moving animals to better grazing, often returning after dark too exhausted for more than a quick meal before collapsing into bed. Margaret, meanwhile, discovered that her reputation as a healer brought both blessing and burden. Hardly a week passed without someone arriving at their door seeking help for ailments, ranging from snake bites to influenza. She never turned anyone away, driven by a combination of compassion and the knowledge that frontier communities survived through mutual support. But the constant demands on her time and energy left her depleted. There were evenings when Thomas returned to find Margaret sleeping upright in her chair, having finally sat down after hours of tending to a sick child or treating a ranch hand's infected wound. And he would carry her gently to bed, marveling at her strength while worrying about the cost of such generosity. The tension between them grew subtle but persistent, manifesting in small irritations rather than open conflict. Thomas resented the constant stream of strangers in his home, particularly those who arrived at inconvenient hours or stayed longer than necessary, and he struggled to voice these feelings without seeming selfish or cruel. Margaret, sensitive to any suggestion that her healing work was unwelcome, withdrew emotionally when she sensed his frustration, reverting to the self-sufficient isolation that had sustained her through 5 years of solitary living. They began moving around each other with excessive politeness, that particular courtesy that signals distance rather than affection, and their conversations became focused on practical matters while avoiding deeper emotional territory. The comfortable intimacy they'd been building seemed to evaporate in the oppressive heat, replaced by a careful neutrality that left both feeling lonely despite sharing the same house. Thomas found himself remembering the years after his first wife's death, when silence and solitude had seemed preferable to the risk of further loss, and he wondered if he'd been foolish to imagine that he could successfully build a partnership at his age. Margaret, for her part, questioned whether she'd traded one form of isolation for another, exchanging her physical solitude in the desert shack for an emotional distance that might prove even more painful. The crisis came in late August, when a family of settlers traveling to California stopped at the ranch desperately seeking help. Their youngest child, a girl of perhaps 4 years, had been bitten by a rattlesnake 2 days prior, and the parents had exhausted their limited medical knowledge trying to save her. Margaret examined the child quickly, her face grave as she assessed the extent of the envenomation and the infection that had set in from improper treatment. She told the parents honestly that the situation was dire, that even with her best efforts the child might not survive, but that she would do everything in her power to help. For 3 days and nights, Margaret barely left the child's side, administering remedies, monitoring symptoms, and fighting the fever that threatened to consume the small body. Thomas watched from a distance, seeing his wife pour everything she had into this battle against death. And something shifted in his understanding. He realized that her healing wasn't a hobby or even a calling. It was as fundamental to who she was as ranching was to him, and asking her to limit that would be like asking him to give up working with cattle. On the second night, as Margaret dozed fitfully in a chair beside the makeshift sickbed they'd set up in the spare room, Thomas brought her coffee and sat with her in the darkness, keeping vigil while she rested. When she woke with a start, disoriented and immediately reaching to check the child's breathing, Thomas caught her hand and held it firmly, telling her quietly that he understood now, that he'd been wrong to resent the demands her healing placed on their life together, and that he was proud of her gift, even when it made their life more complicated. The child survived, though it was a near thing, and when the grateful family finally continued their journey westward, they left with a profound debt to Margaret and a story they would carry with them about the healing woman of the desert. But more significantly, the crisis had forced Thomas and Margaret to confront the fundamental question of their partnership. Could they accept each other fully, including the aspects that created difficulty or inconvenience? Or would they continue to chip away at each other's essential nature until nothing authentic remained? In the exhausted aftermath of the child's recovery, they talked honestly for the first time in months, moving past polite distance into genuine vulnerability. Thomas confessed his fear that Margaret's healing work would consume her entirely, leaving nothing for their partnership, and admitted that he'd been trying to protect himself from the pain of losing her by maintaining emotional distance. Margaret acknowledged that she'd been using her healing as a shield, throwing herself into caring for others rather than risking the intimacy that true partnership required, repeating the pattern of self-sufficient isolation that had protected her after Daniel's death. They both recognized that they were standing at a crossroads. They could retreat into the safe distance of a practical arrangement, or they could move forward into the vulnerable territory of genuine partnership, accepting the risks that came with fully opening their hearts to each other. The decision to choose vulnerability over safety wasn't dramatic or instantaneous. It unfolded gradually through a series of small commitments and adjustments. Thomas began involving himself in Margaret's healing work, not as a practitioner, but as a supporter, helping to prepare her treatment room, assisting with patients when extra hands were needed, and learning enough basic medicine to be genuinely useful rather than merely present. He discovered unexpected satisfaction in this supporting role, finding that his calm presence during medical crises had value, and that watching Margaret work with such skill and compassion deepened his appreciation for who she was. Margaret, in turn, made efforts to establish better boundaries around her healing practice, designating specific hours when she was available except in true emergencies, and being more selective about which cases required her personal attention versus which could be handled through providing supplies and instructions. She also began teaching some of her knowledge to other women in the surrounding area, recognizing that creating a network of skilled practitioners would better serve the community than trying to handle everything herself. These adjustments weren't always smooth. Old patterns reasserted themselves during times of stress, and both occasionally reverted to their instinctive responses of withdrawal or overcommitment. But they'd established a foundation of honest communication, and they learned to recognize the warning signs when distance began creeping back into their relationship, addressing problems before they calcified into resentment. As fall arrived, bringing cooler temperatures and welcome relief from the brutal summer heat, the ranch began showing the results of their combined efforts over the past year and a half. The cattle herd had grown healthier and more numerous, benefiting from Thomas's attentive management and Margaret's knowledge of which plants provided the best nutrition and which areas of the range offered the most reliable water. The garden Margaret had established produced abundantly, providing vegetables for their table and surplus to trade with neighbors, and her herb cultivation had become substantial enough that she was selling medicinal preparations to the general store in Silver Springs. The ranch house itself had been transformed, with Margaret's touches evident in everything from the curtains she'd sewn to the improved kitchen layout that made meal preparation more efficient. Thomas had built her a proper workroom for her healing practice, a small addition to the house with shelves for her herbs, a clean workspace for preparing remedies, and a separate entrance so that patients could come and go without disrupting their private living space. The structure was modest but well crafted, and Margaret had cried when she first saw it, understanding the gesture as Thomas's acceptance and support of her calling. He'd been embarrassed by her tears, uncomfortable with emotional displays, as many men of his generation were, but also quietly pleased that his work had moved her so deeply. Their second winter together brought a different kind of test, when an unusually severe storm system settled over the region, dropping temperatures to levels rarely seen in that part of the territory. Thomas spent anxious days ensuring his cattle had access to shelter and breaking ice on water sources, while Margaret worked to protect her garden and preserve as much of her herb crop as possible. The cold stretched on for weeks, creating hardships throughout the scattered ranching community, and their home became an informal gathering place for neighbors who needed assistance or simply wanted the comfort of company during the harsh weather. Margaret's medical skills were constantly in demand as people suffered from cold-related injuries, respiratory illnesses, and the various ailments that flourished when people were confined in close quarters with poor ventilation. Thomas found himself hosting impromptu gatherings in their main room, offering coffee and conversation to ranch hands and small homesteaders who stopped by, ostensibly for medical help, but often simply needing human contact during the isolating cold. These gatherings revealed something important about the role they were building in their community. Their ranch was becoming more than just another cattle operation. It was becoming a hub of support and stability, a place where people knew they could find help when they needed it. Thomas, who had spent years keeping others at a distance after his first wife's death, discovered unexpected satisfaction in this role, finding that opening his home and life to others enriched rather than diminished his existence. The cold snap finally broke in late January, and as temperatures moderated and the land began recovering from the freeze, Thomas and Margaret took stock of both their ranch and their relationship. They'd weathered multiple challenges together: the brutal summer heat, the crisis with the sick child, the demands of Margaret's healing practice, and the severe winter weather, and had emerged with a partnership that felt solid and real, rather than tentative or conditional. They'd learned to communicate honestly about their needs and frustrations, to support each other's essential work, even when it created inconvenience, and to maintain their individual identities while building something shared. The ranch was prospering in ways that reflected both their contributions, and their home had become a place of genuine warmth rather than just functional shelter. But perhaps most importantly, they'd both healed from the deep wounds of previous losses, not by forgetting or diminishing those experiences, but by allowing themselves to risk love and connection again, despite knowing the potential for future pain. Thomas no longer spent his evenings brooding in solitary darkness, and Margaret had stopped using work as a shield against intimacy. They'd become genuine partners in every sense, sharing not just responsibilities and daily routines, but also hopes, fears, and the vulnerable honesty that true intimacy requires. Spring arrived with the explosive color characteristic of the desert after a wet winter, transforming the landscape into a temporary garden of wildflowers and new growth. Thomas's cattle grazed contentedly on the abundant forage, and Margaret's garden flourished with the combination of stored winter moisture and warming temperatures. They received word through a traveling peddler that the family whose child Margaret had saved the previous summer had made it safely to California and had settled successfully near Sacramento, and that the little girl was healthy and thriving. The family had sent a letter of gratitude and a small payment, which Margaret initially wanted to refuse, before Thomas convinced her that accepting it honored the family's need to express their thanks. Life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than desperate, with work remaining demanding but no longer consuming, and with time carved out for the small pleasures that made frontier living bearable. Evening conversations on the porch, occasional trips to Silver Springs for supplies and social connection, and quiet mornings spent over coffee before the day's responsibilities began. Thomas found himself laughing more frequently, his weathered face creasing in ways that reflected joy rather than just years of sun exposure. And Margaret's quick smile appeared more readily, transforming her features with a lightness that had been absent during her years of solitary survival. Their partnership deepened in subtle ways that neither would have predicted during those first uncertain months. Thomas developed genuine skill at assisting with medical cases, his steady presence and calm competence proving invaluable during difficult births or serious injuries. And Margaret trusted him completely in these situations, knowing he wouldn't panic or freeze when quick action was needed. She, in turn, had learned enough about cattle ranching to be genuinely useful rather than merely present, and she often rode out with Thomas to check on the herd, appreciating the time together and the beauty of the land they were working. They developed their own private language of small gestures and brief touches, Thomas's hand on Margaret's shoulder when he passed her chair, Margaret's fingers brushing his arm when she set his coffee down. The wordless communication that flows between people who've learned to read each other's moods and needs. They still had disagreements, still experienced moments of frustration or misunderstanding, but these no longer threatened the foundation of their relationship because they'd learned that conflict could be navigated without abandoning partnership. The ranch prospered under their joint stewardship, becoming known throughout the region as a well-managed operation run by a couple who embodied the frontier values of hard work, mutual support, and service to community. By their third summer together, Thomas and Margaret had achieved something remarkable in the harsh desert landscape. Not just survival, but genuine flourishing. The ranch supported them comfortably, providing a modest but reliable income through cattle sales and Margaret's medical practice. And they'd built a reputation that brought both respect and friendship from their scattered neighbors. Thomas, approaching his mid-50s, moved with the confidence of a man who'd found purpose beyond mere endurance. And the chronic sadness that had shadowed him for years after his first wife's death had transformed into something more peaceful. Not forgetfulness, but acceptance and the ability to honor the past while fully inhabiting the present. Margaret, now in her early 40s, had blossomed in ways that went beyond physical health, her intelligence and capability finding full expression in the multiple roles she'd created for herself as healer, gardener, rancher's wife, and community resource. She'd stopped defining herself primarily through loss and had built an identity grounded in her strengths and contributions, finding satisfaction in work that utilized her skills fully. The arrival of a young couple seeking to homestead nearby brought an unexpected opportunity for Thomas and Margaret to pay forward the support they'd received during their own difficult times. Samuel and Emily Carter were barely in their 20s, full of enthusiasm but woefully unprepared for the realities of frontier living, and they'd claimed a marginal piece of land that would challenge even experienced settlers. Margaret saw in Emily a younger version of herself, a woman from more comfortable circumstances, trying to adapt to harsh conditions with more determination than practical knowledge. And she took the young woman under her wing, teaching her desert gardening, food preservation, and basic medical skills. Thomas, meanwhile, worked with Samuel on the practical aspects of building shelters, managing livestock, and understanding the land's limitations and possibilities. The mentorship was time-consuming and occasionally frustrating, as young people often learned best through their own mistakes rather than from others' advice. But it was also deeply satisfying, giving both Thomas and Margaret a sense of contributing to the community's future. They watched Samuel and Emily make the inevitable mistakes of inexperienced homesteaders, offered help without creating dependency, and celebrated the young couple's successes as they gradually learned to thrive in their chosen environment. The relationship with the Carters also highlighted how far Thomas and Margaret had come in their own partnership. They worked together seamlessly when helping the young couple, their different strengths complementing each other perfectly, and they communicated with the easy shorthand of people who'd learned to anticipate each other's thoughts and needs. Emily commented once that she and Samuel hoped to have a marriage like theirs, solid, respectful, and characterized by genuine partnership rather than just division of labor. And Margaret had smiled, remembering how uncertain and fragile their beginning had been. She told Emily honestly that good partnerships weren't found, they were built, piece by piece, through honest communication, mutual respect, and the willingness to keep choosing each other, even when it would be easier to retreat into self-sufficient isolation. Thomas, overhearing the conversation, had added gruffly that it also helped to marry someone stubborn enough to refuse to give up on you, even when you were being difficult. And Margaret had laughed, acknowledging the truth in his words, while noting that he'd shown similar stubbornness in refusing to let her retreat behind the wall she'd built during her years alone. As autumn arrived again, marking the completion of 3 full years since Thomas's wagon had broken down near Margaret's desert shack, they hosted a small gathering to celebrate the ranch's prosperity and their partnership's success. The event was modest by town standards, a barbecue for neighboring ranchers and their families, with tables set up in the yard and music provided by a ranch hand who could coax surprisingly sweet melodies from a battered fiddle. But it represented something significant: Thomas's willingness to open his life and home to community, a stark contrast to the isolated existence he'd maintained for years after his first wife's death, and Margaret's integration into the social fabric of the region. No longer the mysterious widow from the desert, but a valued member of the community. Children played in the yard while adults talked. Cattle business mixed with gossip and laughter, and Margaret moved through the gathering with quiet confidence, her medical knowledge making her a sought-after conversation partner for anyone dealing with health concerns. Thomas stood slightly apart, watching the scene with satisfaction, and Samuel Carter joined him, commenting on how fortunate Thomas was to have built such a successful life. Thomas considered the words, thinking back to that July day when his wagon wheel had shattered and he'd stumbled toward an unknown shack, desperate and injured, with no idea that he was walking toward salvation of a type he'd never imagined. He told Samuel that fortune played a role, certainly, but that the real key had been recognizing opportunity when it appeared and having the courage to risk vulnerability after years of protective isolation. He spoke about the temptation to remain emotionally closed after experiencing profound loss, about how survival could become a habit that precluded truly living, and about the choice to build something new rather than simply enduring until death. Samuel listened with the serious attention of someone who sensed he was receiving important wisdom, though Thomas suspected the young man wouldn't fully understand until time and experience gave context to the words. Margaret joined them, slipping her hand into Thomas's with casual intimacy, and the three stood together watching the gathering, representing 3 stages of frontier life. Samuel at the beginning of his journey, Thomas in his established middle years, and Margaret having traversed the full arc from arrival through loss to renewal. The evening deepened into night, with the fiddle's music floating across the desert air and stars emerging in their thousands above the darkening landscape. And Thomas felt a contentment so profound it was almost painful, understanding that this moment, ordinary by most measures, represented everything he'd nearly given up on finding again. The years that followed continued the pattern established during those first 3, with the inevitable mixture of challenges and rewards that characterized frontier living. Droughts tested their resourcefulness, market fluctuations affected their income, and the normal progression of aging began to mark their bodies with the accumulating weight of hard physical labor. But these difficulties were weathered together, with each crisis strengthening rather than straining their partnership, and with their reputation for stability and mutual support growing throughout the region. Margaret's healing practice evolved, as she trained other women in her techniques, creating a network of practitioners who could share the burden of medical emergencies while maintaining high standards of care. Thomas expanded his ranching operation cautiously, never overextending, but steadily improving the quality of his herd and the efficiency of his operation. And he took satisfaction in being consulted by other ranchers who respected his judgment and experience. The Carter's homestead survived its precarious early years and began to flourish, providing Thomas and Margaret with the ongoing satisfaction of seeing young people they'd mentored building successful lives in the harsh landscape. Perhaps most significantly, Thomas and Margaret maintained the emotional intimacy they'd worked so hard to build, continuing to communicate honestly about fears and frustrations, rather than allowing distance to accumulate through small silences. They'd learned that partnership required ongoing attention and effort, that the work of building relationship never truly ended, but rather evolved as circumstances and people changed. Thomas, now in his late 50s, moved more carefully than he once had, his body bearing the cumulative impact of decades of hard labor. And Margaret, approaching 50, showed similar signs of aging, though her hands remained steady and her mind sharp. They faced these changes together, adjusting their work patterns to accommodate physical limitations, supporting each other through minor injuries and illnesses, and accepting the reality that their time together, however precious, would not be infinite. This awareness of mortality didn't diminish their joy, but rather intensified it, making them more conscious of treasuring ordinary moments: morning coffee before dawn, evening conversations on the porch, the comfortable silence of two people who needed no words to feel connected. On a clear October evening, 5 years after their marriage, Thomas and Margaret sat in their accustomed places on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in familiar shades of orange and purple. They'd spent the day working together on various ranch tasks, their movements coordinated through years of practice, and now enjoyed the peaceful exhaustion that came from meaningful labor. Margaret leaned against Thomas's shoulder, fitting into the space that seemed designed for her presence, and reflected aloud on how different her life might have been if his wagon wheel hadn't shattered that July day. If she'd continued living in isolated survival mode in her desert shack, slowly calcifying into permanent solitude. Thomas responded that he was grateful for the breakdown, grateful for the desperate stumble that had led him to her door, and grateful most of all for her willingness to heal not just his dislocated shoulder, but the deeper injuries of grief and isolation that had been crippling him far more severely than any physical wound. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching darkness claim the landscape they'd worked so hard to transform into home. The desert remained harsh and unforgiving, still capable of killing the unprepared or unlucky. But they'd learned to thrive within its demands, building a life characterized by partnership, purpose, and the quiet satisfaction of work well done and love faithfully maintained. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.